May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. The wheat and the weeds. This story of a farmer whose servants planted the wheat, and then when the plants came up, there was wheat, and then throughout the wheat there were weeds. And they go to him and they say, "Didn't you plant good seed?" And he says, "Yes, this is the work of an enemy who has planted these weeds among our wheat." "Well then, Master, should we pull up the weeds?" Which seems like a very reasonable question. We've all spent plenty of time on our knees in the gardens pulling weeds out from the spaces where they're growing so that just the plants that we want will grow there. And how many of us have spent hours I find that a screwdriver works, but they make these long-handled things that you can put into the dandelion root and shove it down, and you do a little circle like this and the whole thing pops up. Dandelions are the bane of the modern lawn. We all know that you've got to pull the weeds out if you want to have a proper garden. And yet the farmer says, no, do not pull the weeds out, because in pulling the weeds out, you will pull up the wheat as well. The wheat will come up as well. In an older translation of this, it's called the wheat and the tares. Maybe you've heard that. In fact, in the hymn we sang this morning, our opening hymn, it talked about the wheat and the tares. And a tare is the name of a particular plant. It's a weed. So it is the weeds in the weed in the wheat. But the tare is a particular weed that when it's first growing, it looks so much like wheat you can't tell which is which, right? And so that helps, that translation difference actually illustrates for us one of the points of the story is that we're not so good, as it turns out, in discerning what's a weed and what isn't a weed. What's fruit and what is weed? In fact, the example I gave of the dandelions, right? We've all pulled dandelions from our yards and we see them growing, and you get out there, you want to get them before that cute little puffball explodes and spreads them throughout your yard. And of course, as kids, we all went into our yards and picked them up and blew them and spread them all over the place because it's really fun. The dandelions are a really cool plant, right? You pick the puffball of seeds and you blow on it and they spread out in the wind. That's one cool thing about it. The flowers are really pretty, little yellow flowers. The leaves are edible. There's actually herbal remedies, medicines that are made from them. These are pretty wonderful plants. It's really only in this desire to have a uniform lawn that looks exactly just right that we've decided that they're weeds. And it turns out, it's an aesthetic choice. We're not really that good at deciding what is a weed and what isn't a weed in the case of the wheat and the tares. And then it turns out that in our yards, it's kind of arbitrary. I mean, we pull up the dandelions so that the other flowers we planted can grow. What's what? Which one's a weed? Which one's fruit? Well, I remember a folk tale that the first time I heard it was, we had this cassette tape that we would play for the kids while we were driving in the car. And it was a cassette tape of folk tales being told by Odds Bodkin, O-D-D-S Bodkin. And he's a wonderful storyteller with the melodic voice that just sort of draws you in and mesmerizes you as he tells the story. And he told the story of the missing axe, okay? And the story of the missing axe goes like this. There was once a man whose most beloved possession was his axe. Now, this was a magnificent axe. This is a Chinese folk tale, by the way. So there's going to be some very non-Christian parts in it. I don't think they're offensive or anything, but just so you know where it's coming from. His axe, along the handle of the axe were carved the faces of all of the gods from the temple. Remember the Chinese temple with all of that stuff, right? So, and the axe blade was so sharp that it would cut through a log like a knife through soft butter. This axe was his crowning possession, his most wonderful possession, and he worked as a woodsman, so it was very, very important to him. And one morning he went out to his shed to collect his axe and go out and cut timber, and it wasn't there. And so he pulled apart his shed. He pulled the bags of rice out of the way, and he tossed open the cupboards, and he pulled back the boxes in the corners. He threw everything out into the yard. And then he went into his house, and he pulled his house apart, but it wasn't anywhere. There wasn't an axe. His beautiful axe wasn't anywhere. And just then, he's just so upset. He looks up, and there is his neighbor's son. And he looks at his neighbor's son, and he thinks, that boy stole my axe. He looks like a thief. He walks like a thief. He talks like a thief. And he ran up to him and he grabbed him by the collar and he shook him and he said, "Where's my axe?" And of course, the little boy had no idea what he was talking about. Well, the next day, the man got up and he got his second axe, which was a poor thing, barely able to even hold an edge. And he went out to his favorite grove where he cut timber. And there, in the stump of a tree, right where he had left it, was his prize axe. And so he picked up his axe and he did his work for the day. And when he got back home, he saw his neighbor's son playing in the yard. And to his surprise, he looked like any of us. He walked like any of us. And he talked like any of us. We're not so good at seeing people and judging them for their guilt or their innocence. When we look at someone, who knows how we will judge them? And of course, in this story, it was his own anger, his own frustration over the loss of his axe that led him to see a criminal, a thief, in this boy playing next door. So on a personal level, we're really pretty bad at judging others and deciding who's guilty and who's not. And the problem with this is that on a social level, on a cultural level, a societal level, it has profound implications. When I was in middle school, the war on drugs began. It was during the Nixon administration. They decided that they would publicize this war on drugs. And it seemed like such a righteous thing, because after all, drugs and drug addiction are a bane to society. There's no question that drugs are a bad thing. And anyone who deals drugs should be punished. And the people who promote this problem of drugs in our country, this has to be stopped. We'll declare a war on drugs. And over the last 50 years, the results of the war on drugs, this is actually the 50th anniversary this year is of this war on drugs. What has happened is that the rate of incarceration in our country has gone from 165 people per 100,000 to over 500 people per 100,000 are now incarcerated. Most of them on crimes of drug sales and possession. And then you look into that a little bit more deeply and you find that 40% of the people in prison are people of color. whereas they're only 13% of the population at large. And so there's something wrong here. Many of us read a few years back the book, The New Jim Crow, and what we found was that this war on drugs created this whole division in our country, this whole two-tiered, two-caste system, and it was largely along racial lines that system was created. And we have people who have been arrested for drug possession or for drug sales, and they can never really become a full-fledged member of society anymore because they can't rent an apartment. They can be denied an apartment. They can be denied a job, even low-level laboring jobs that, I mean, you can't, so many of them can never find work because they have a criminal record, all right? And so both of these stories, the fable, the Chinese folktale, right, and the story of mass incarceration and the war on drugs in our country illustrate for us how difficult it is for us to look and discern between weeds and wheat, especially when it has to do with other people. Now, I told you that Neil ruined my sermon this morning, and he did, but we're going to work it out together, all right? Because he wasn't wrong. He points out, well, yes, but you have to be discerning. You can't just say, okay, we're never going to judge who's a problem and who's not. I mean, we have policies in our churches that we do background checks for anyone who's going to be working with children, and we have trainings so that we are all trained to have policies and procedures that keep children safe. You know, the procedures include things like we don't leave children alone with one adult in a room downstairs, kind of a thing, right? We always have two adults. And then the chances of something happening to a child by these very simple policies and by doing careful things like background checks, we avoid problems that are very real. I mean, I don't know how tired of it you are, but it breaks my heart. After more than a decade, we continue to hear more headlines about child abuse in churches. Sadly, mostly in the Catholic Church. They're the ones that are getting beat up the most right now, but it happened in all churches. It happened in this church, not this congregation, but the Episcopal denomination. When I went through the ordination process, they asked me all kinds of questions to make sure they had a very, very deep background check. They don't want problem people in this role. So we have to be discerning. But as individuals, when we look out there and we see other people, we're not particularly good at it. The folktale illustrates that. And the cultural outcome of the war on drugs after 50 years illustrates that. And so as Christians, I believe that we are called to look at others and look for the image of God in them. Look for the sacred in them. When you encounter someone, if you are looking for what's wrong with them, if you are looking for how they are evil or what bad deeds they have done or might do, you will find it. We're pretty good at that. But if instead we are looking for the sacred in the other, looking for the humanity of the other, looking for those points of connection where we can enter into relationship together, where we can share the love of God with each other. In that way, we build the kingdom of God. And as Neil pointed out, we can't give up on our obligation to care for those who are vulnerable. No question about it. But what we're called to, and what the wheat and the weeds parable shows us, is to let God be the ultimate judge, and when we encounter one another, to be looking for God in one another, for the humanity in one another, for the sacred in one another.